I'm James Hughes, bioethicist and resident techno-progressive.
And I'm Nir Eisikovits, philosopher and resident Luddite.
And you're listening to Prosthetic Gods, an optimist and a grump on tech, a podcast where we explore the social, ethical, and political impacts of emerging technologies.
Dr. Hughes, how you doing on this snowy day?
I am politically depressed as usual, but this is all the more reason to dive into the complex philosophical issues of fantasy and speculative fiction.
Philosophical escapism, one of our fortes.
Yes, it's part of our, what did the Soviets call it when they passed around samizdat?
I don't know, you would know, but I don't.
Yeah, well, the samizdat's a Soviet dissident word, so you need to give me credit. I know the dissident language.
There you go. You'll get in trouble with your friends from the DSA.
That's right.
Yeah. So Dr. Hughes and I are talking about Pluribus today, the remarkable new show from the makers of Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. So, Jay, do you want to give us a summary of the basic premise?
Yes, well, let's start with some prehistory before we get to Pluribus, because Pluribus is a show about a hive mind, which has a venerable history in speculative fiction. And there are probably examples that go back quite a long way, but the ones that come to mind easily for me, Zamyatin, who was a Soviet dissident, wrote a novel called We in the 1920s, which eliminates the first-person pronoun, and basically is a description of a dystopian impression of a communist society where people aren't allowed to think as individuals anymore. Not exactly a hive mind in the technological sense that we're thinking about today, but when you get to something like the 1950s, again, communism is a stand-in in fiction for, or hive minds are a stand-in fiction for communism. And the invasion of the body snatchers is a classic example. This alien invasion is basically kidnapping people and growing copies of their bodies that are made out of vegetable matter, I think was the idea of that story. But, and they know everything about the person and can replace them in society until they're ready to reveal their takeover. There were also Children of the Corn type stories about groups of young children suddenly having hive minds that the Children of the Corn in particular, which you said was
Stephen King short story or novella.
Stephen King short story, right. But there's like half a dozen or a dozen of these kind of stories. But for me, they always represented my own and many urban people's horror at the idiocy of rural life. The idea that, you go back home for your family reunion and it's like everybody's part of a hive mind and you're not part of it. Then you get to the 80s and you get the Borg, which is introduced in Star Trek, which is a technological hive mind. Children of the Corn's more of a mystical one. Body Snatchers is more of a, whatever aliens are doing. But the Borg really do wire people's heads together with brain-computer interfaces, and they will assimilate you. And the Matrix is another version of a hive mind, which is a shared reality that is used for the purposes of control. People still have their alleged individuality within it. But at any rate, there's reams and reams, books and books written about the history of these different impressions of what hive minds represent, all their connotations. You gave an example.
I wanted to plug for an early interesting long poem of the hive mind. This is Mandeville's 1714 Fable of the Bees, which is a sort of hive mind image of capitalism, where capitalism is just for him the kind of hive mind that manages to coordinate private vices into public virtues, so that the whole idea of capitalism is a sort of conversion mechanism that makes a hive mind out of greed and stupidity and desire for accumulation, etc. You would like it very much. It's your kind of poem. Yeah.
Well, and the bees are a perfect metaphor here that actually Vince Gilligan is using. He uses the color yellow, which seems to be a reference to Carol, the protagonist, as a kind of a wasp an invasive species inside of the hive. And then there's lots of metaphors about the hive as being like a beehive.
And then, of course, by the way, if you sort of move a little bit from representations of popular culture to actual popular culture, if you drove around a few years ago at the slightly earlier stages of TikTok and you saw teenagers doing TikTok dances in unison, you'd get also a sort of glimpse of a hive mind, which I think is partly on Gilligan's mind in making the show.
Yeah. I mean, as we'll talk about, the theme that human beings need connection, that there is no such thing as a real individual, and that we all are always embedded in social life, one way or the other, social mental life, and that some of our rituals, like collective dance and collective song, have been ways to bond people together for building trust and in-group attention, in-group attentiveness, so that we could exist as a species. So this goes back a very long way. It's keyed into our mammalian psychology that we want this kind of bonding, but how much do we want? That's the question.
And what's the cost of a lot?
Right. So the plot of Pluribus starts with the receiving of a radio signal, which is some 80 seconds long or something like that. Once it's decoded, it turns out to be 4 chemical signatures that are supposed to be created together and to create some kind of organism or virus or something, which they do it in a military high security facility, the people who build this virus, but not high security enough because, of course, it infects one person and then that person infects everybody else. And it seems to have a mind of its own. It seems to have intents and purposes of its own that we don't understand at the beginning of the story at any rate. And it quickly, covertly takes over the world until it really reveals itself about a month later by flying jets with chemtrails that are dropping virus particles all over the world. And everybody gets infected except for 13 people. And our protagonist, Carol, is one of these 13 who's immune to the virus. And she discovers this when the virus takes over the world. Her partner gets eaten by the virus right before she dies, her wife. And she discovers when she gets to the hospital, everybody wakes back up from their viral infection and they're all part of one hive mind. And so right off the bat, we know what's going on. And then she goes home and she talks to a guy who is in Washington, D.C., and the TV is only for her because she's the only person in North America.
It's the president.
Yeah, well, she thinks it's the president. It turns out to be some undersecretary of agriculture because he was the only guy in a suit who was still alive. But yes, he's talking directly to her because all of television at this point is only for her. She's the only non-hive mind connected person.
So the effect of the virus for the listeners who haven't watched yet is to unify all individual consciousnesses except for 13 people into a hive mind or one consciousness. And as a result, all the individual bodies who no longer view themselves as individual persons know what everybody else knows. So, every janitor is also an astronaut, and every astronaut is also a janitor and a teacher and a poet and so on, right?
Which is brilliantly illustrated by scenes where a character will be walking from apparent poverty and be doing one thing without any verbal coordination with a bunch of other people doing one thing, then get in a bike, drive to an airport, get in a plane, get in the pilot's seat, and fly a plane. And then, they know how to do everything. They can do surgery,
right,
et cetera.
And the process of joining, just so we sketch out the plot, the process of joining had a cost, had a good number of people, I don't remember what it was, didn't 880 million. That's a lot of people. I got a
10% of the people on the planet died.
Yeah. So talk about breaking some eggs, right? In the process of joining, 10% of the population doesn't survive the joining. I guess we should say a word about spoilers. This is I'd say, watch out for spoilers, but the truth is this is not a profoundly plot-driven show. It's an idea-driven show. I'm not sure how meaningful it is that Jay and I are giving spoilers. Is that fair, Jay?
Right. There will be spoilers if you're really worried about that.
Yeah.
The only thing that's really a big spoiler, which I will be talking about, is what the virus's intent seems to be. Because it makes a big difference.
Well, we don't know that yet. So that would be a theory, no? Or do we know that at the end of the first season?
I think when she says that we need to pass this virus on, and that they're building an antenna to do that. If it's not the intent of the virus, it is one of the subsidiary goals of the virus to spread itself.
Yeah, and
so it's part of this.
Yeah, that's the subsidiary goal of all viruses. So in that sense, if you've taken biology, it's not a spoiler.
That's right. So we have many philosophical issues that are raised by the show. It's an incredibly rich text, but one is the consequentialist problem that's raised in the second episode, because Carol meets members of the hive, and every member of the hive is connected with every other member of the hive, and they no longer have personal identities. But she is sent a woman who looks like the kind of woman that she would be romantically interested in. And turns out she is, in fact, romantically interested in this kind of woman. But then she wants to meet the other survivors, and she wants to get them on board with a project of liberating humanity, which seems to be an absurd project, until you discover that the virus also makes the entire hive mind treat anybody who's not in the hive mind as an absolute person that they need to satisfy, right? This is your interpretation of it. So the needs of non-hive connected people. Now, at first you think, well, this is like some coding. It's like perfect compassion, except moronic compassion, because it will give you anything you want, including nuclear weapons. She eventually asked, would you give me a nuclear weapon? Yes, we'd even give you a nuclear weapon. We wouldn't be happy about it, but we'll give you one. So that kind of makes it not a wise not a wise beneficent being, but otherwise it will give you everything you want. And everyone seems to be happy, and there's no more war, and there's perfect coordination. So when she meets some of the other survivors, she says, I want you to help me liberate humanity. And most of them are not interested in that, either because they don't think it's possible or haven't grokked the project. But Diabate is a guy from Mauritius, I guess, who has taken residence in Las Vegas in Elvis Presley's old quarters and commandeered Air Force One, and asked for a harem and a supporting cast where he can basically make his own James Bond movies with him as James Bond and have a harem.
So he's pretty busy.
Beautiful. He's a very busy guy, supermodel. So he's both personally delighted by this turn of events, but also he poses the question to her: isn't this better?
Yeah. Which
I think is the overall question of the show. Is that,
and it's not clear if he's asking, "Isn't this better for him?"
It's just better for the human race.
Yeah, which it certainly seems to be, as far as he's concerned, better for him. But also, as you say, better for the human race, because there's no more hunger, there's no more war, there's no more poverty, there's no more homelessness, there's much less disease. There's no more comparison and competition. All of the kind of psychological traits that with, specifically, for example, the rise of social media. We've been talking a lot about hyper-comparison as a hit on mental health. All of that is gone.
Every psychopathology
exactly, has been cured, and everybody is unsettlingly nice to each other and collaborative, except for 2 out of the 13 people who, for some reason that we haven't figured out, are immune to the virus. Carol and this guy Manusas.
I have to make an aside that there's also a show out now called Fallout, which is based on the Fallout computer game series. And it's just hilarious and lovely for those of us who like science fiction of this sort. Again, a post-apocalyptic, people emerge from silos. But in the latest episode of Fallout, there is a scene where a bunch of people have been rescued from the wasteland and given brain computer interfaces in the backs of their heads that turned them into nice people. And the protagonist discovers this situation where there's all these people acting like corporate drones, and she wants to liberate them. And her father, who did this to them, explains that they were all living miserable lives. And she asks, well, do any of you want to go back to the wasteland? And they're all, no, it's really dangerous out there. We love being here with these jacks in our heads. And they bring in two guys who have not yet been jacked, and they start to fight and are about to kill each other. And the father says, you can stop this at any point by just hitting this button and jacking them into the matrix. And she eventually does, because it is in fact better for them to be jacked in than not. And that's what the show asks, is like, for a lot of people in the world, isn't it selfish for us to say that this wouldn't be better?
And in a way, that's the question that what's the name of the hedonist character?
Diabate.
Iabate, that's the question that Iabate poses. Again, he says, this is better for me, and It seems to be better for everybody else. So why would I want to interfere with it? But really, there only seem to be now 14 persons in the world, right? There's the 13 people who were immune, and the hive mind. So the hive mind has one consciousness, as it were, and it speaks in the first person plural. So they no longer know how to say I, or they have a hard time with saying I. They speak in we.
Speaks in the third person plural.
The third person plural. Yeah, sorry.
Which they make a funny comment about. She says, I want you, the hive mind woman that she's in love with, I want you to start using the first person pronoun. And she keeps screwing it up. And she says, you'd think you're so smart, but you can't get pronouns right? It's like, I understand that comment, where that comment came from.
There you go. That's funny. So, I mean, on some level, this has exponentially reduced the number of persons in the world, if you think about it, even though it hasn't. I mean, it also reduced the number of bodies in the world by 10%, but it reduced the number of persons in the world dramatically.
Right. And it will reduce it much further because, again, spoilers, one of the features of the virus is that it causes them to become radical vegetarians, Jainists almost, where they can't even harm insects. They can't pick fruit. And that is part of, apparently, the motivation for why they will do anything that remaining individuals ask of them, because the suffering of these remaining individuals is the only suffering left in the world that they are causing, and so they're willing to alleviate in any way they can. But one of the consequences of that is that they're going to starve to death because they can't figure out how to feed themselves without agriculture. And they go around and collect the 880 million bodies, and they freeze them. And very soon in the narrative, Carol discovers that they're eating dead people. So there's a Soylent Green reference, basically. They're eating dead people. And she goes and tries to convince people. And there's this fantastic sequence where she goes to Diabate and he says, oh, is this about them eating dead people? She says, you knew about that already? And then he puts on a video where John Cena, the actual actor John Cena, who has been absorbed into the hive, explains in this kind of infomercial that this is the only way for them to continue to survive, but doesn't say the crucial part, which is that it's not going to work for that long, maybe 10 more years for them to eat everything that's left in freezers and eat every piece of fruit that falls off the tree.
Wouldn't more bodies continue to die, though?
They will continue to eat themselves, and you presume that they'd be, that any animal that collapses like roadkill, where they shouldn't have a problem with. But anyway, the Diabate and the other survivors have been trying to help them figure this out, if there's some way for them to survive. But it's like, okay, that's not my idea of an intelligent. In the first place, there's no obvious intentionality until we discover later that there is at least the intentionality to build transmitters so that they further the virus itself. But it's not a logical or rational being in that sense, because it's committed to a set of values that will lead to its own destruction. But I mean, I suppose you could say that is rationality.
Yeah. Also, you would hope that if it had all the world's greatest intelligence, they could figure out a way to make synthetic foods that didn't depend on eating dead people.
Yeah, my expectations of what a super intelligent, I mean, that's the other thing, the kind of the technology of what it means to be a super intelligence. They obviously can aggregate statistics immediately, quickly. So like they know, they can feel and tell you about things that are happening to bodies on the other side of the planet through the connection that they have, which appears to be radio mediated.
Yeah. Because
another character, Manusos, in Paraguay, he discovers the radio channel that they're communicating on, and he wants to come up with a plan, and this probably is season 2, where they're going to come up with a plan to try to disrupt
Do you think the 13 people are a risk to the hive mind, though? Like, I mean, as I was watching it, part of me was asking, is there an option for the hive mind collectivity to coexist with the 13 people?
I think the 13 people are a risk in the sense that any one of them having the temper tantrum that Carol has twice. Carol's first temper tantrum causes the entire hive mind to have a seizure, which she's later informed kills 11 million people. And we don't know how many her second temper tantrum has. But
by the way, the death of 11 million people, or 10% of the population in the earlier number, is a big deal for us, a huge deal for us, a gigantic deal for us, because we have a concern for persons and we have this sort of Kantian inflected religious idea of every person is an entire universe unto themselves, etc. But for a hive mind society, that is not axiomatically true. Even the temper tantrums are not the same. I mean, Carol is devastated when she finds out that her temper tantrum causes that kind of damage to the hive mind, but the hive mind people, not so much.
Right. For the hive mind, it's like shedding some skin or,
and making some food also.
An ordinary biological process, in this case, traumatically done. But, there's another science fiction parallel here. There's a novel by Greg Bear written in the 80s called Blood Music, and it's about the taking over of the world by a nanobot. So what we call the gray goose, where the entire planet gets eaten by nanobots. And you think it's an apocalyptic end of the human race scenario until the very end, when the people who have been eaten by the gray goo are still in there and can still talk to you. Now, it's not exactly the same as here, because in that scenario, they still have some individuality. But at least in this scenario, everybody who dies, their consciousness is recorded, apparently. As long as the hive exists, their consciousness is preserved inside the hive. So all of those bodies, all of those consciousnesses continue.
Yeah. So in that direction, let's start thinking of what it is that is sort of being criticized here, or that is being at least brought up for review. And one classic candidate is this show. Look at this show as a critique of utilitarianism, crude utilitarianism, even sort of. So the sort of school of thought initially identified with Jeremy Bentham, the greatest happiness for the greatest number, as the rule of thumb, or what you should and what you shouldn't do. And as a critique of utilitarianism, for one thing, Bentham himself, by the way, was weird in this way. He left a will that his body should be mummified and displayed at University College London, and
it still is.
Yeah, I even have a selfie with him. And that once every so often it should be wheeled out with its little cage to the pub where the members of the Utilitarian Society meet, and they can have drinks with him. And he has this kind of called the auto icon. He has this very detailed set of instructions about what should be done with his body. And sometimes I show it to students when we talk about utilitarianism. And there's the reason that it's such a perfect example is there's the kind of irreverence there, right? It's like, well, Bentham is saying, well, what good am I as food to worms in the ground, just because some religious tradition says I should be buried? Rather than that, I'll, keep my body mummified here in the entrance to University College. People will stop by it, say how weird it is, and get them talking about utilitarianism and maybe make them good utilitarians. So there's this sort of very anti-traditionalist thrust to it. Very similar, by the way. I thought of Bentham when we found out that the way these people sustain themselves is by eating dead people. And their argument is a perfect utilitarian argument, which is, why not? What good are they dead? This way they can feed us. So you have this kind of first utilitarian feature of the rejection of all sort of metaphysical reverence, if you will, or of traditional reverence.
Right. Which reminded me of John Haidt's research, because John Haidt started 25 years ago, 30 years ago, by asking his students what problems they had with consensual cannibalism, like you die, you give your body over to your cannibal friends, or consensual adult incest that does not produce offspring. So those two scenarios, and he was trying to get people to express, these moral, what moral qualms they had. And from a utilitarian point of view, those qualms are illegitimate. The only real question is maximizing the good, and the good in this case would be getting everyone fed.
Right. And that's either a very powerful critique of utilitarianism or a very powerful critique of the way we waste resources, right? So certainly
and it's underlined in the show by the event when she goes to her local grocery store to get groceries and it's all empty. She's told that they've started consolidating all the food because they need to have this 10-year plan of winding down the human race, basically. And she says, but I want my Whole Foods back. And they mobilize 100 people or, a bunch of trucks and food from wherever they've been taking it. They all show up. They put it back on the shelves, an entire grocery store stock just for one woman. And it's such a great commentary, I think, on the selfishness of middle class alleged individualism. It's like, I'm such an individual, but my life requires this global supply chain.
All right.
That you had to recreate on the fly.
Yeah. That's a very good observation. Going back to a slightly more obvious observation, the other level of critique of utilitarianism here is that the sort of greatest happiness for the greatest number emphasis. Why would you take seriously what a grouch like Carol or some other idiosyncratic person wants when you can have a world in which, so many more people are benefited? So if Carol, with her individualism, poses any kind of threat to this, the obvious utilitarian answer is you get rid of Carol. And in fact, we find out that they are plotting to figure out a way to have her join. The hive mind does think that, she's potentially wasting resources or she's potentially a threat to the basic idea.
And I loved how they framed that because it is one of the classic bioethical dilemmas of you have a patient who thinks that what they want is X, but you as a paternalist physician or social worker or whatever know that what they really need is Y. How much coercion are you allowed? What does it mean for them to be compos mentis enough to refuse something that you think they really need?
Right.
And in this case, the hive looks at Carol as just a sick, diseased person who has no idea what she's talking about in terms of how much happier she's going to be once she's joined. And she looks at it the opposite. And in the end, they plan to win. So.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, I think of effective altruism as a version of utilitarianism, and the famous sort of effective, some of the famous effective altruist examples as, if you are really interested in poetry or you're really interested in, Sanskrit translation as your intellectual passion, but you have the talent to make a bunch of money on the stock market, your moral obligation is to actually forget about the poetry and make a bunch of money on the stock market because then you'll be able to give more money away. It's a very classical utilitarian kind of argument.
Yeah, but you have no problem with telling a parent that they have an obligation to go to their job, even though they prefer to be poor, right? Because they have an obligation to their family. I know that you don't like this kind of an argument, but I'm sure that you find circumstances where you would make that.
Yeah, of course. But yeah. I like the second version of the argument because it states a far more communitarian set of commitments, namely to your close circle. Which I think it's fine.
You should only have commitments to your close circle, not to the humankind as a whole.
Basically, they should fade.
Okay,
they should.
I'm just want to be clear.
Yeah, well, I want to be clear too. They should fade. You should have stronger commitments, much stronger commitments. I'm not a utilitarian. The utilitarian thinks you should have the same kind of commitments to all units of utility. I think that's insane. I think you should have much stronger commitments to your family than to your neighbors, and more to your neighbors than to the people the next town over, and so on and so forth. If everybody behaved like that, probably you would have better results than in a utilitarian scenario. But for now, what I'm saying is the show brings those kinds of questions, I think, into play in a pretty dramatic way. But it also brings up this kind of paradox that it's the heart of utilitarianism, namely, why would you be committed to or want to pursue the greatest benefit and happiness for the greatest number if then each person in that greatest number is obligated to do the same, right? So, in other words, on the one hand, you'd think I'm supposed to care for strangers because strangers are capable of making a life project and they're special, and I should worry about them having the conditions for realizing those life projects. But then it turns out nobody is allowed to do that on a utilitarian picture, right? So there's something weird about that.
Say it again. I don't understand what you think is weird about this.
Why would you want to pursue the greatest happiness for the greatest number if each one in that greatest number is actually discouraged from or morally criticized about pursuing their own project? It's exactly a pluribus kind of picture, right? Each one in that multiplicity is supposed to themselves pursue the greatest happiness for the greatest number. So what makes the stranger worth defending, right? What makes the stranger an appropriate object of moral concern if they're robotically supposed to do the exact same thing that you've done? It's a sort of flattened robotic society, just like in the show. Does that make more sense?
Well, I think I think you're getting onto something, which for me, I want to defend the idea that we will eventually have these kinds of machines in our brains and that they will eventually allow us to share our minds in ways that we currently don't. I think that process started with language and will continue with technology. But I don't think that there's any necessary, for me, I think that those experiments in the future will probably be all the way from the full loss of individuality and collective identity that we see here and intermediate stages where you maintain individual autonomy and agency, but have shared mental life of some kind, right? So, and that I think is the happy intermediary that I would prefer.
Yeah.
Is that that whatever value we get out of individualism should be preserved, and then we should also see how much we can get out of shared mental life.
I mean, in a way, you're talking about the difference between utilitarianism 1.0 and utilitarianism 2.0. Part of my problem with this show, in a way, is that it is a depiction of a crude kind of utilitarianism, of Bentham's utilitarianism. Mm-hmm. John Stuart Mill sort of, improves on it a great deal, right?
It wipes out all individual agency and all individual project that would otherwise have been
right. And Mill, both in utilitarianism and in On Liberty, gives you a much more palatable, much more plausible version of utilitarianism, which is the kind of world that tends to generate the greatest happiness for the greatest number is a world in which individuality is preserved, all things being equal. And so it's not a mathematical kind of utilitarianism. It's much more of a sort of rules or tendency based utilitarianism. So, but that's not what the show is about. That's not what totalitarianism is about. Totalitarianism is a crude version of utilitarianism, right? So it's that kind that is being promoted. Now, what you say is very, very interesting. So, for example, brain-computer interfaces, which we've been talking about in a different context, might be a tool for promoting a mix between individuality and a hive mind.
And my favorite example of that is Alistair Reynolds. He's got a series of novels in the Revelation space that he's written, in which there's a species called the Demarchus, who all have brain-computer interfaces in their head. And the focus of those devices is to summarize everything that they're thinking and everything they want, all of their individual agency, as an automated citizen module, basically, that is then being asked to vote on everything that's happening in their community all the time. So there's so many votes taking place that you can't possibly consciously monitor or intervene in them. But your module is kind of summarizing what you would think and voting on your behalf. That's one kind of shared mental life. But you could also imagine that, just like instead of having 100% of your brain filled up with the hive, it's only 20%. And so you always know what the rest of the hive is doing, but you also have your own part of your brain that's working. That's the way I imagine it could be.
Well, it's interesting because taking off from there, you could certainly interpret the show in parallel, not so much as a critique of rudimentary utilitarianism, but as a commentary on our increased level of interactions with AI models. A large language model is a hive mind in some basic way. It's a statistical average of the internet. We are interacting with them more and more. When we brainstorm for an article or for preparing for a podcast episode with ChatGPT or with Claude, we are actually talking to a hive mind, right? We're sort of querying the average knowledge of the internet. When you add on to that the fact that increasingly younger people are entering into relationships with chatbots, those are statistically and from the point of view of code, relationships with a hive mind. Maybe they're so attractive because our relationships with each other suck, but they kind of are relationships with a hive mind.
Cody Turner, our previous postdoc, and Nir have written an article about AI sycophancy. But there's a wonderful sycophancy interaction in the course of Pluribus where she calls in a member of the hive to chat with her. And she says, do you know my novels? And she says, oh, yeah, of course we know your novels. Because every one of her fans has been eaten by the hive. And she was a popular fantasy writer. And so she says, well, which part of my novels do you like? And they say, oh, we love everything about your novels, right?
Because there's somebody there in that hive mind who likes each novel, right?
Right. Yeah, there's somebody in there who likes every single thing about her novels. Except then she says, well, what did my ex-wife think about my novels? And it turns out that the ex-wife actually didn't like her novels and didn't tell her that. And was
the ex-wife was her literary agent also.
Who's also her literary agent. So she was benefiting from gaslighting her.
Yeah. So that's a fascinating point that you raise, because I was going to ask you, so Carol, the protagonist of the show, develops a relationship with this character, Zosha, who's part of the hive mind. And she is clearly attracted to her, but she's also lonely. And they develop a romantic relationship. And I was going to ask you, and there's something very compelling about it and touching about it.
After she causes Zosha and the entire hive to freak out, have these millions of people die, and Zosha says to her, I need some space, by which she means I, the hive, need some space. So they empty out all of Albuquerque so that no members of the hive will be in contact with her. And she spends a month. She spends an entire month alone in Albuquerque, not knowing what to do with herself.
Yeah, but as I was watching that and being moved by the relationship, which was hard not to be moved by, I was wondering, is that just me anthropomorphizing the same way I would anthropomorphize a conversation or a friendship with an AI model? Because can you have a relationship with a member of the hive mind? It looks like a relationship, but you can't really. This is a person who knows absolutely everything about anything that anybody else knew about you, right? So she had the entire consciousness of Carol's wife. Or anybody who had interacted with Carol and is still alive.
All of the fans that she hated, because she was not a happy fantasy writer, but all those fans are in there. They all want to know what's happening next in the novel, so she starts writing a novel again. But they also get through Zosha to sleep with the author, and it's like everybody in the world is sleeping with the author. And she says this to one of the other unaffected people who has a son. She says, your son is not only your son anymore, your son is also your president and your gynecologist. And then she doubles down on that point by asking the boy later when she meets him, what kind of speculum do you prefer to use? And he says, well, I generally prefer this kind of speculum. And he's like 6 years old or something. So
Yeah. But as you said, and this actually really sort of makes me double down on the analogy with the AI relationships. As you know, I'm very self-righteous about how awful AI relationships are, but it turns out her relationship with her wife wasn't that hot either. If she was secretly hating on her novels and making money off of them, that's not very attractive.
Right. Even her passion project, which she thought would be her great literary, great American novel.
Right. She was writing a passion project on the side.
Right. And her wife was encouraging her, but it turns out
she didn't like that.
Yeah, she didn't like that one either. And so this is another feature of the virus, is that it makes it unable for them to lie, but they actually do great at deception through misguiding Carol.
Do you have an example of what you mean by that?
Well, they say, like when she's trying to figure out if there's a way to stop the virus, or she can only figure that out because she asks directly and then doesn't get an answer. She knows because it has it has already confessed that it can't lie to her. The fact that it won't answer certain questions is in fact an answer.
Yeah.
So, but its ability to deceive, but then also having a moral code not to lie. It's just another thing that Vince Gilligan did to make the story a little bit more complicated, right? The fact that it's so compassionate that it's going to starve to death. It's like, what kind of rational being is that?
Yeah. So at one point in the story, this character Manusas enters the plot line, and Manusas is one of the 13 people who resist the virus too. And he is much more gung-ho even than our protagonist Carol about eliminating the virus. And so he goes through a huge amount of danger and difficulty travels up from Paraguay towards Albuquerque where Carol is, so that he can find her, to discuss strategies of killing the virus with, or reversing the virus with.
He seems to be a religious man, I think, by the way. He carries Catholic icons with him, and he sleeps in churches on the way. So he's very deeply moral.
He's deeply moral in all of the bad ways that you associate with Kantianism. He's profoundly dogmatic.
That's right.
Right? He's profoundly he leaves money at gas stations, even though the gas is now free in this world. He won't sort of sleep in other people's houses because he still sort of holds to the sanctity of property and ownership, even though the categories no longer exist.
He burns his beloved car instead of turning it over to the hive.
Yeah.
Nothing
was
on this planet
offensive
belongs to you.
I love that car. That was the one part of the show I couldn't watch. The horror.
That's right. Yeah.
So, the thing about Manusas is that he is not a ton more likable than the hive mind. At least he wasn't to me.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. I thought you might be a Manusas stan, but
I'm not a Manusas. I'm a Carol all the way through. I'm Team Carol.
You're willing to use the beneficence of the stupid hive mind, but
I want the supply chain of a Whole Foods brought to my doorstep. I would never burn the car. I would
while you laugh at us behind our back.
Exactly. I would reach a deal about the car. But so Manusas' character is set up, I think, as a critique of the sort of competing sensibility of a kind of moralistic dogmatism. And Carol is somewhere in between. I mean, Carol seems to be sort of a sentimentalist. She seems to be mainly animated by her grouchiness, like I am.
Right. She's deeply lonely. There's a sequence where she lets the hive take her on a whirlwind tour of all the things that she wished she'd done with her wife, her dead wife. And so, there's some attachment.
By the way, she asks Zosha to take her on the tour, even though Zosha is the hive. But that's part of the show's conceit. So it's like a romantic vacation they have in a bunch of different places, she and Zosha, right?
With the entire world, a romantic vacation.
Yeah, it's like a vacation with Instagram.
I mean, I think there are people who definitely identify with Manusas as has the kind of rigid individualism that he has. But yes, it's definitely set up as a kind of conversation between Diabate, who's like, fuck it, I'll take everything you got, versus Manusas, who's like, don't give me anything. And Carol's trying to make some decisions along the way.
Yeah, and I've certainly heard of plenty of people who read plenty of people who identify with the hedonist character, who I would, be 007 in Air Force One too for a very long time before my moral instincts reawoken.
All the secrets that you could find out, it's like who killed JFK or whatever.
Exactly. There's a Platonic version, by the way, of a similar idea, which is Gaiji's ring in the republic, which amounts to the same functionally, which is this story about somebody who can wear a ring and become invisible, and what would you do if there were absolutely no consequences to your action? And that's the hedonist character in some way. You know, one feature of the show that I wanted to ask you about, I think one of your and my favorite episodes was this very long episode in which there was hardly a word said, where Menusos makes his way through a jungle and through various roads up towards...
One of the most courageous pieces of television I've ever seen. The fact that he would have an entire episode without any word, almost any word.
So this was a very sort of meditative, abstract piece of television in what's supposed to be a blockbuster show. I loved it. I heard plenty of people who thought it was very boring, which I also get. I actually agreed that it was boring, but I totally bought into the boring. I mean, I thought it was boring and beautiful at the same time. There's a sort of meta commentary there. I thought that our own hive mind makes it pretty difficult for us to tolerate that. Like our sensibilities, our aesthetic sensibilities, our expectations for stimuli have changed so much as a result of interacting with our own technology that it makes it pretty hard for us to tolerate that kind of episode. Do you buy that?
Yes. And I think he was making a commentary about the fact that Menusos, as this radical individualist, he had no problem committing himself to this kind of isolation and not getting any help and making this long journey, whereas Carol was basically driven insane by being isolated for 1 month to the point where she joyously re-embraces the hive presence after they come back. They agree to come back. So I think that episode was trying to make that. This is what a life of isolation in this world would look like. And I think that it was brilliant. Nozick's experience machine. I wanted to bring this up. I mean, they're not living in the Matrix in this show, but Diabate's pleasure palace basically does kind of raise the question of if you, and this was, I think, Vince Gilligan's original question that led him to come up with this scenario is, what does it mean to live a meaningful life if everybody around you gives you everything you want? And then he had to come up with the world in which that would be the case, and this is that world. But so if you were living in the experience machine, as Nozick imagined it in the 70s, a world where you could have everything that you want, would that be a meaningful life? And that has inspired lots of transhumanist adjacent philosophizing since then. And I think the show answers this in a variety of ways. One is Diabate's life looks meaningless immediately to Carol. She's like, what is wrong? She says, what is wrong with you? And it's like the way that a lot of us feel about MAGA these days is like, what is wrong with you, really? That you would enjoy this. But on the other hand, we don't want to be Menusos. And so there's some place in between where having our own individual aspirations in the context of social meaning. Like Carol scratches a lottery ticket at one point and wins whatever that lottery ticket was, but it's completely meaningless in the context, right? Because there's no one to appreciate it and there's no more money and so on and so forth. So I just think it does raise that kind of consequentialist problem about what it means to be a flourishing person.
Yeah, and I think it actually highlights a feature of the experience machine, which is to be okay in that kind of world, you have to be okay with realizing that all these things that you're given are not real. So Diabate's pleasure depends on his ability to turn a blind eye to the fact that everybody participating in his pleasure world has not chosen to do it, and they are slaves in some basic way.
Which is part of Carol as a lesbian. And also as someone who had been threatened or put through conversion therapy at one point. That's part of her story of her individualism, but also the reason that she rescues Zosha, who's perfectly willing as part of the hive mind to go with Diabate on his Air Force One harem cruise. And he wants her and Carol doesn't at that point. But then when Carol sees that it's basically a ship full of slaves, or sees it as a ship full of slaves, she wants to rescue at least Zosha from that. And I think that's, it does kind of play with that question of, is this a situation of consent? I mean, they are they tell her and Diabate that they're consenting.
Even the slave analogy might be wrong in a way, because when there's no will coming into play in this scenario in the first place. Like the very idea, I mean, it more sort of, I think, gravitates towards, some of the kind of points that Dostoevsky makes. When there's no will and there's no individuality, there's also no responsibility, right? So I'd say it's more like virtual reality. The world that Diabate has set up for himself, and his ability to enjoy it depends on enjoying it while knowing that it's virtual, which is hard to do actually, because for most of us the enjoyment of X depends on at least some possibility that X is real,
which is very much underlined by the opening of episode 3, I think, where he's playing. It looks like the beginning of a James Bond movie or part of a James Bond movie. There's a cast of hundreds in his suite in Las Vegas playing. He's playing poker with a Bond villain type guy, and he's being served by waitresses in low cut dresses and everything. And they're all just actors from the Hive. They all just have been told by him that he wants to put on a show where he plays as if he's James Bond. And it's like, I think most of us who look at that go, okay, that could be fun for like 10 minutes. But after that would be an incredibly disillusioning, existentially challenging situation to be in, to have everyone just pretend that, that you are the man.
Yeah. I wanted, as I watched Carol, I was remembering, the underground man in Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground, who's like the absolute paradigm of this kind of grumpiness. I wanted to read you a passage from it that really reminded me of her. Yeah. So bear with me for a minute here. So he says, the underground man, "Now I ask you, what can be expected of man since he is a being endowed with strange qualities? Shower upon him every earthly blessing, drown him in a sea of happiness so that nothing but bubbles of bliss can be seen on the surface. Give him economic prosperity such that he should have nothing else to do but sleep, eat cakes, and busy himself with the continuation of his species. And even then, out of sheer ingratitude, sheer spite, man would play you some nasty trick. He would even risk his cakes and would deliberately desire the most fatal rubbish, the most uneconomical absurdity, simply to introduce into all this positive good sense his fatal fantastic element. It is just his fantastic dreams, his vulgar folly that he will desire to retain, simply in order to prove to himself, as though that were so necessary, that men still are men and not the keys of a piano, which the laws of nature threaten to control so completely that soon one will be able to desire nothing but by the calendar. And that is not all. Even if man really were nothing but a piano key, even if this were proved to him by natural science and mathematics, even then he would not become reasonable, but would purposely do something perverse out of simple ingratitude simply to gain his point." And that reminds me so much of Carol, you have this world, which Diabate loves so much, in which all the cakes and all the goodness are presented to you. And both Carol and, in his own way, Manussos are willing to blow it up out of spite, simply to, prove that they have free will. And I think Dostoevsky, puts his finger on something real there, that we have a kind of psychological attachment one way or another to individuality.
Well, the critique of both our ethics and our psychology of weird, that almost all psychology research is done on college students in the North who are white, educated, and individualistic. And I think that it is hard for us to imagine, because I am certainly white, educated, individualistic, kind of weird guy. And so I am primed to reject the offer of the Hive and to celebrate Manussos, at least Carol, if not Manussos' individualism. But I think that we probably have to take a step back, because I think Vince Gilligan has done a convincing job of at least a lovely apocalypse. It is still an apocalypse because they're all going to starve to death, but it's a lovely apocalypse. And I do see its loveliness.
Except if it has to stop being lovely. I mean, this is a little bit sort of the tension between 1984 and Brave New World, right? And if you have a 1984 kind of totalitarianism that you hoist on people, eventually, like in Dostoevsky's story, they'll do any spiteful thing to show that they're not piano keys. If you have a Brave New World, more benign sort of, contemporary Chinese version, if you will, of totalitarianism, and maybe they're more tolerant of it. Maybe they are willing to tolerate it for longer. So,
I'm a sufficient utilitarian to say that I hate plots that are so individualistic where they say, oh, it's a choice between this one person and the entire planet. Mm-hmm. And I just chose this one person. I hate plots, right? But in this case, the question is the existence of the hive actually and because the existence of the hive now is only one person out of, there's 12, as you said, there's 13, 14 people in the world, and one of them is the hive, right? So if sacrificing the hive in that circumstance, does it only count as one person or does it count as 7 billion?
Yeah, that's a great question. Connects to the point I was making earlier. In a utilitarian world, what is the genuine value of individual projects in a sort of hardcore utilitarian world? But to your point about the loveliness of the utopia, Carol is at least partly seduced by it, right? She starts out closer to Manousos than she ends up. She starts out more dogmatically against it. She's overcome by the fact that Zosha is attractive, by how lonely she is, by how much, even she at some point kind of buys into some of the fun she can have with this.
Well, the hive has no problem using her ex-wife's memories against her, saying, oh, this is just like that time we went to Iceland or whatever. And she keeps saying, stop using my ex-wife's memories, but they keep doing it. So I think it's not only that she's attracted to Zosha, her ex-wife is in there. There's certain things about the hive that she does appreciate.
One thing that you brought up in a conversation that we had before the show, which I think is important, is any one of us who's just a normal individual has some attractions to the hive mind. In other words, human beings have a need for individuation, but they also have a need for sort of disappearing into something that's larger than themselves, and a sort of balanced, healthy life is a life that goes back and forth between those two. If you sort of want to get a visceral sense of what I'm talking about, just look at those pictures in a large sporting event, a soccer game, of like people doing the wave, or of people losing themselves in a rock concert or in a meditation retreat, or whatever. So we all, this is the old Nietzschean distinction between the Apollonian and the Dionysian, right? Apollo being the god of light and distinction, Dionysus being the god of wine partying and debauchery, where you lose yourself. There needs to be a balance between those, and this is a sort of thought experiment of what happens when the balance disappears.
And it's an old sociological observation that there is no individuation without social embeddedness. The wolf children which there are very few actual examples of, children who are raised without any social interaction are not capable of anything that we would call individuation. And so I think that in that context, as I said, as soon as we invented language, we began to have a shared mental life. And this idea of a hive mind is an extreme version of that, but it's on a continuum with the fact that we already share our mental life with others through words.
Right. But our entire sort of process of maturing and becoming, to use Mill's language, your own person, as it were, is learning how to stick out from the primordial hive mind just a little bit.
Think you do, right? Think you do. How many of us actually are individuals? This is the classic question. The way you become an individual is by adopting some subcultural set of cultural indicators.
Right. Yeah. So if you were one of the 13, Jay, what would you do?
Well, I'm a white man, so of course it's my obligation to save the human race. Right?
There you go. Jay's manifest destiny.
Unlike all these selfish people in the show, I would be like Manousos trying to save things. No, I don't know. I would not see this as an attractive scenario because I immediately want to know, and I think there is a misstep. Why she doesn't actually ask. It tells her that it won't lie to her, but she's just so incurious at first about what are you doing here? What is your purpose? And that would have been my first question. Do you have a purpose? What projects are you engaged in? Eventually, she goes to see how the rest of the world is living now, and they're all living in collective.
See, I would fruitfully read some Burke to them immediately. That would be my Carol. That would be my Carol move.
But you wouldn't have. It's like an LLM. You wouldn't have to read Burke because Burke is already in.
Well,
there,
then we'd have to discuss why Burke wrote Reflections on the French Revolutions, Reflections on the Revolution in France, and how much he liked that hive mind and how that ended up.
Well, everyone who existed under totalitarianism or radical individualism is in there. But yeah, this gets back to, there is no individual agency left. So they're not taking a vote side, right? It's not like the faction of one versus the other. Although there is a suggestion that there is some internal disagreement at one point when it's like, we would not be happy about giving you a nuclear bomb.
Yeah.
But I think we would probably decide to do that.
The cynical political point is that this was kind of the French Revolution, but they took care of the terror within, half an hour rather than, several years. All the eggs were broken right away. All the omelets were made on the spot. And you sort of jumped into utopia without the decades of attempts that always in the real unfolding of history make utopia impossible. So that was an interesting thought experiment, I thought.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a fantastic show. Everyone should take a look at it. It was Apple TV. Apple TV has been knocking it out of the park with
it really has.
Sci-fi television.
Yeah, it really has. So
Severance.
Yeah. Well, as you know, Jay and I are dear friends who agree on one thing, that Pluribus is a great show.
Well, if we're done with this, it's my turn to do the media recommendation for the week. Since we've already done Pluribus, I'm going to talk about Andor, which I think I got my entire family to watch it, and I convinced them because I have said, and I think it's true, that it's one of the most important anti-fascist texts of our time. It was.
How's it an anti-fascist? I haven't watched it yet. So how's it an anti-fascist?
So you could say that the Star Wars universe is already implicitly anti-fascist because you've got, the Nazi-coded Sith Lords and Emperor Palpatine and Darth Vader and so forth. And they walk around in Nazi uniforms, and you've got the rebels who are more of the resistance. And so it's already fascism coded. But the heroes of it are magical beings who, channel their magical powers. And so it's not revolutionary in that sense. But what they decided to do with Andor, as this is really the only Star Trek or Star Wars property that has gone in such a mature adult route. The guy who wrote it decided to be directly inspired to make explicit reference to actual revolutionary human, non-magical revolutionary roles that people take in the struggle against this kind of a power. So there's a guy who's kind of like the secret spy master who's living on the capital planet. There's a woman who's a liberal political leader, a legislative leader who has to eventually defect and lead the resistance, but who's also very rich, and so she has all the challenges of being rich. And the principal guy, Andor Cassian, is a thug, basically a thief, who gets recruited into the rebellion, and he's directly inspired by young Stalin, who was also a thief and a thug. So it's got a lot of explicit political parallels. But the thing that people are recognizing right now is that basically Minnesota is our current Gorman. Gorman is a planet in the show, not to give too much away, but Gorman is a planet that they need to mine so intensively that they basically have to destroy this planet. And they decide well ahead of time that they're going to demonize them in the press because the emperor has control of the press. They're going to send in covert agents who are going to inspire violent resistance. They're going to use troops provocatively in order to get those troops shot at or beaten by the crowd so that then they have an excuse to start mowing people down. And so basically Minnesota is Gorman in this context. And I think the various speeches that are given by different actors in the sequence, all of them have contemporary political resonance. So I just highly recommend that people take a look at Andor. I mean, in a way, seeing a depiction of fascist and anti-fascist violence, especially since the end of it's a 2-season thing, and it ends right before Rogue One, and they used all the actors from Rogue One. Rogue One was made first, and they brought all those actors back to make the 2 seasons of Andor. So it goes the 2 seasons of Andor, then Rogue One, and then Rogue One is what happens right before the very first Star Wars movie. So you see eventually that, and if you know the Star Wars universe, eventually that Emperor Palpatine gets defeated and the new alliance gets put up. But this show is just about the struggle and the human sacrifices that people make. So Andor, highly recommended.
I'm going to check it out.
It's always a pleasure talking to you, even with your misguided views.
Yeah, well,
I'm sure I can fix you. I believe I can fix you, Nir. That's why we have this relationship.
You're my Steve Austin. Remember that show? We can fix him.
that's right. I don't. Yeah, might be cheaper than $6 million in this case.